It's just worth mentioning at the opening of this chapter, Swedenborg tackles a difficult question. And it so happens I was talking with someone about it yesterday. You have the Ten Commandments, which are universally acknowledged laws. You know, it's pretty obvious that you shouldn't do things like murdering and lying and stealing and so on. So why is it that at the occasion of the giving of the Ten Commandments, it was done with such pomp and ceremony? Why were there so many fireworks to announce what seems to be pretty obvious to most people? Now, I just want to mention this chapter's place in the book. So far, we've dealt with the nature of God, and there's been 3 chapters on that. And then we've dealt with the nature of the Word, the Bible, and there's been a chapter on that. And it follows on from this chapter on the Bible. So in some regards, the chapter on the Ten Commandments is like it's an example of what he's been speaking about in what he's talked about the Bible. Its inner sense, and you get the sense here. It's explained in both the external and the internal senses. But what I want to say is there's more to it than that. There's something fundamentally important about the Ten Commandments as we talk about them here. And this chapter is a link from what he's talked about before, about God and the Bible, and what he's going to talk about next, which is faith and charity. Now, the other thing I want just to point out about this chapter title is the word at the beginning, catechism. Now, what's a catechism? Does anybody know what a catechism is? So, the one I'm particularly familiar with, I know of, is there's a Catholic Catechism, and it's a little booklet with a number of simple statements and questions and answers. And the idea is that you memorize these as, to understand what your faith teaches. Now, here he's using this word in regard to the Ten Commandments. Now, let's just follow it through, what a catechism means. So, literally, it means to instruct or teach by word of mouth. So it's the idea of here's something simple you can memorize. Okay? And it means a summary of the principles of Christian religion in the form of questions and answers used for religious instruction. Okay, that's what a catechism is in modern parlance. Now, look at what Swedenborg writes about the Ten Commandments. He says, the Ten Commandments is in short compass a summary of the whole of religion, making a link between God and man and God. And elsewhere he goes on and he says, the Ten Commandments contains everything to do with love for God and everything to do with love towards the neighbour. In other words, the Ten Commandments is everything you need to know. Now, it demonstrates a fundamental difference between what Swedenborg writes and many of the other Christian churches believe. So you get, as we mentioned, a Catholic Catechism, and you memorize that and you understand the Catholic faith. So that if someone comes to you with a question and says, what does this mean? You can give them an answer. But if the Ten Commandments is everything you need to know, it's not about answering a question, it's about the way you live your life. The way you live your life. That is what is fundamentally important, and that's what we need to hang on to. Now, what he does through this chapter is he takes each of the commandments and he deals with them, and he's very systematic about them. He names what the commandment is, and then he says, right, this is the natural meaning of it, and he does it in a very broad way. You'll get a sense of that in a minute. And then he moves on to the spiritual meaning and the celestial meaning, and then he makes a final comment about the meaning of that particular commandment. So each of the commandments gets 4 paragraphs. The natural meaning, the spiritual meaning, the celestial meaning, and then some related comment. So we're going to take you through one of those commandments. We're going to look at you shall not murder, just to give you an idea of what's going on. So we're going to work from the natural, which is the way Swedenborg works. We're going to begin at the bottom. So the natural meaning of you shall not murder, well, it's mostly pretty obvious. We're forbidden to kill. We're also forbidden to cause injury to reputation. Okay? It's not about harming the person, it's about harming their name. He says is fundamental to this natural meaning of this commandment. Feelings of enmity, hatred and revenge are also forbidden. So you can see that he's really broadened out what he means by, what we mean by this commandment, you shall not murder. That's just in the natural sense. Then in the spiritual sense, he says it's forbidding all manners of killing and destroying human souls. So harming the spiritual life of a person. And he enumerates them. So he says, for instance, turning them away from God, religion and the worship of God, making these things a subject of scandal and persuading people of things which cause them to be hated and rejected. So that's all tangled up in this spiritual meaning of this commandment. And then the celestial level has to do with the Lord. So being unjustifiably angry with the Lord, hating him and wanting to blot out his name. And then the comment he offers, he talks about the nature of the human soul if it is not reformed by the Lord. So there's 2 points I want to make about all of this. The first is that if you can fulfill the innermost aspect, the highest aspect of this commandment, if you are able to avoid being unjustly angry with God, you will, as a result, obey every lower aspect of that commandment. So if you can fulfill the commandment, you shall not murder, at the highest level, the most internal level, then everything else below that follows on. But the second thing to realise is that we're not born into that state. We are not born into a state where we obey the highest level of this commandment. And so what we need to do, and what we first of all focus upon, is what we call shunning evils as sins. So recognising what you shall not murder means in a natural sense and moving away from it, shunning it. 8 of the 10 commandments contain no mention of love for God and love towards the neighbour. They do not tell us that God is to be loved, nor that God's name is to be kept holy, nor that the neighbour is to be loved, nor that he should be treated honestly and uprightly. In general, they prescribe the evil that is not to be willed, thought or done, either against God or against the neighbour. The reason why we are not commanded to do what is directly the work of love and charity, but only to avoid doing their opposites, is that insofar as a person shuns evils as sins, so far he does the good actions of love and charity. So if you can identify a sin and push it away, shun it, that is when you begin to do and fulfill the 10 Commandments, the work of love and charity. So the Word is written for us in our lowest, most degenerate states. It addresses the worst that we can be, but it calls us to the highest. And that's what we have to hang on to when we look at the 10 Commandments. Now, we mentioned before the rich young man, the rich young ruler who spoke to Jesus. And what he really struggled with this was this idea of what he called good. So the story, if you remember, the rich young ruler, he approaches the Lord and says, "What must I do to enter eternal life. And he says, well, I've done all of these commandments. And the Lord says, well, you've got to give up all of this other stuff that you treasure, the things that you value. Now, we look at that story in terms of worldly wealth because he was, in a worldly sense, wise. But when we look at the image of riches in the Bible, what we realise, it's not talking about material possessions, it's talking about spiritual riches. That young man represented the whole of the Jewish nation. The Jewish people who regarded themselves as religiously rich because they kept the commandments to the letter. And that for them was a source of great pride. We are the blessed of God because we do the commandments according to the letter. But Jesus is telling them, no, it's not enough. There's so much more to this commandment than just keeping the letter. There's all of that internal meaning that we have to apply to our daily lives. And the thing is, I think that that young man approaching the Lord must have had some inkling that the external stuff was not enough. Because why else would he ask the question? Okay, I want to move on and give you one more example. And the reason I'm doing this is because it gives you an insight into me, I think. A couple of weeks ago when we did, or was it even last week? Perhaps it was last week, looking at Doctrine of Life, there was a little paragraph about what charity is in regard to a clergyman, a preacher, and what it means to be a preacher in the best sense and in the worst sense. And I find that really quite inspiring for myself in the work that I do. But here's another passage that I find really interesting about in Swedenborg's commentary on religion. So we're going to look at observe the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Now, Swedenborg starts by talking about the significance of the Sabbath day for the Jews and how it changed. So just have a listen. In the natural or literal sense, this commandment means that 6 days are for man and his work, and the 7th day is for the Lord, and for him to give man rest. Sabbath, in the language of the original, means rest. Among the children of Israel, the Sabbath was the holiest of observances because it represented the Lord. The 6 days represented the Lord's toils and battles against the hells, the 7th his victory over them, and so rest. Since that day represented the completion of the Lord's whole act of redemption, it was for that reason the height of holiness. The Jews had enshrined in their religious practice something that looked towards the coming of the Lord. Now, notice what he says about what happens afterwards. When, however, the Lord came into the world, so that representations of him ceased, that day became a day for instruction in divine matters, and also a day of rest from work, for meditation about matters conducive to salvation and everlasting life, and a day for love towards the neighbour. And I find that definition of what the Sabbath is wonderfully broad. It allows for so much activity. What we're doing here in terms of, a traditional service, but so many other things that could be and are means of worshipping the Lord. So that's the natural, literal sense for Swedenborg of this commandment. So then if we move on to the spiritual sense, this commandment means man's reformation and regeneration by the Lord. And then in the celestial sense, it means being linked with the Lord, leading to peace as the result of protection from hell. So what I'd really urge you to do is just understand the breadth and the scope of the Ten Commandments. It's very easy to take them as 10 statements and, just think, well, okay, if I just do that very simple thing, I'm obeying that command. But actually there's so much more to them. They're so much richer. They are, in fact, everything you need to know.